The silence of space pressed against the viewport like a held breath. John stood on the bridge of the Prometheus, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the impossible sight before him. Ahead, hundreds of Earth warships hung in the Martian sky, their insignias glinting in the distant sunlight. Behind him, his own fleet stretched back towards Phobos, a ragtag armada of vessels built in desperation, each one a testament to what automated manufacturing could achieve when given enough time and resources. But it was the lead ship that held his attention, the Artemis, her ship. Through the magnified viewport, he could see movement on the enemy bridge, his augmented vision system locked onto a figure, tall, commanding, unmistakable even across the void. Jane. After all these years, there she was, standing exactly as he'd imagined her 1,000 times in his dreams and nightmares. "Sir," came a voice behind him. John didn't turn. He knew who it was without looking. Jessica stood at her station, her fingers dancing across holographic controls with inhuman precision. The humanoid body he'd given her moved with perfect grace, every gesture calibrated to appear natural. Too natural, perhaps. "She's hailing us," Jessica said. John's jaw tightened. "Open the channel." The viewport shimmered, and suddenly Jane's face filled half the screen. Time had changed her. The soft farm girl he'd known had been replaced by something harder, sharper. Her hair was pulled back severely, her uniform crisp and decorated with medals he didn't recognize. But her eyes, those eyes were the same, even if the warmth in them had been extinguished years ago. "John." Her voice was ice. He swallowed hard. "Jane." For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of everything unsaid hung between them, heavier than planets. John leaned forward, his voice catching slightly. "Go back to Earth, Jane. I don't want to hurt you." Her expression didn't change, not even a flicker. She'd expected this, he realized. She'd probably rehearsed her response. Without breaking eye contact with him, Jane raised her hand in a subtle gesture. Someone off-screen acknowledged. "Jane, please." The viewport went dark as she cut the transmission. Behind him, Jessica's sensors began screaming warnings. "Energy spike detected. They're charging weapons." John spun toward his command crew, his moment of vulnerability vanishing. "All ships, defensive formation Delta, shields to maximum." But he was too late. The first neutron beam lanced across the void, a spear of purple-white death that struck the vanguard of his fleet. The destroyer Deimos simply ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant of horrific beauty. Debris scattered like a supernova in miniature. "Return fire," John shouted. "All batteries, target their lead ships." The battle for Mars had begun.
4 years earlier. "Few minutes to launch." John's voice was steady despite his racing heart. He stood in the crew compartment of the Exodus, surrounded by equipment, supplies, and the woman he loved. Outside the rocket, tanks were already rolling across the farmland he'd once called home. Inside, Jane was checking her suit seals for the 3rd time, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "I still can't believe we're doing this," she said, laughing nervously. "Mars. We're actually going to Mars." 5 minutes. John's hands trembled as he pretended to check a readout. His expression changed after he finished the call. He didn't say a word. He had only listened. Her father's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't destroy my daughter's life." "John?" Jane noticed his hesitation. "Are you okay? Who's the call from?" He turned to her, forcing a smile, trying to hide the fact that Jane's father had just pleaded with him not to take her away. "Yeah, it was the government agents again. Don't worry about it. Damn it." "What?" "The launch button. In the control room." He slapped his forehead, the gesture hurried but convincing. "I completely forgot to press it. The automated sequence won't engage without the manual override." Jane's eyes widened. "What? But we only have—"
3 minutes. I know. You need to go press it. The control room is just through the access tunnel. Red button on the main panel. You can't miss it. But there's enough time. Plenty of time. Just run there, hit the button, and run back. You'll make it easily. Jane looked uncertain, glancing between John and the countdown timer. I need to stay here and monitor the pre-flight systems, he continued. If anything goes wrong with the fuel mixture or the guidance system in these last seconds, we're done. He squeezed her shoulders gently. Please, Jane, trust me. You'll make it back. The word trust seemed to decide it for her. She nodded quickly. Okay, I'll go. Run. Jane bolted toward the exit hatch, her boots clanging against the metal floor. John watched her disappear into the umbilical corridor that led to the underground control room. As soon as she was out of sight, his face crumbled. Jessica, he whispered, his voice breaking, seal the hatch. The AI's voice came through his earpiece, soft and uncertain. John, are you certain? Once the sequence begins, do it. Seal the hatch and initiate launch. A pneumatic hiss filled the compartment as massive bolts slid into place, cutting off the access tunnel. On his command tablet, John saw Jane reach the control room, frantically scanning the panel. There is no launch button, Jessica observed. 10, 9, 8. Jane's face appeared on the camera, staring directly into the lens. Her expression shifted from confusion to understanding to horror in the space of a heartbeat. She pounded on the reinforced door. 7, 6, 5. John couldn't watch anymore. He turned away, tears streaming down his face as the rocket began to rumble with awakening power. 4, 3, 2. Jane's scream cut through the static. John, no! 1. Ignition. The world became fire and thunder. G-forces crushed John into his acceleration couch as the Exodus tore free from Earth's gravity. Through the viewport, he saw the underground facility shrinking below, and within it, a small figure at a window, growing smaller and smaller until she was only a speck, then nothing at all. John sobbed into his hands, his shoulders shaking with each breath. Forgive me, Jane, he whispered into the darkness. Forgive me. "5 years earlier. The horse beneath John galloped across the prairie, its hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. Wind whipped at his face, carrying the scent of wild grass and distant rain. For the first time in months, maybe years, John felt something close to peace. It was absurd, really. John Mercer, a Ph.D. in robotics and artificial intelligence, former MIT researcher, wearing a Stetson and riding like some character from an old Western. But that was exactly the point. Nobody looked for a mad scientist on horseback. The farmhouse came into view, a weathered structure that sat atop his real work, a warehouse complex that stretched deep underground, invisible to satellite surveillance and casual inspection. He'd chosen this remote corner of Montana precisely because the neighboring properties were miles apart, because nobody asked questions about a wealthy eccentric who wanted to play cowboy. As John slowed his horse to a trot, he spotted movement near the property line. A rider on a chestnut mare, silhouetted against the setting sun. He'd seen her before, always at a distance, always on the neighboring property, the Wilson farm, if he remembered correctly. The rider seemed to notice him at the same moment. They both paused, separated by perhaps 100 yards in a barbed wire fence. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, almost shyly, the rider raised a hand in greeting. John found himself waving back. The rider, a woman he could see now, seemed to smile before turning her horse and cantering away. John watched her go, surprised by the small flutter of disappointment in his chest. He shook his head, returning his attention to more important matters. In the underground lab, Jessica would be waiting with the latest results from the replication trials. They were so close now, so impossibly close to proving that his theory worked. But as he rode back to the barn, John couldn't quite stop thinking about the mysterious rider next door. Over the following weeks, the encounters became routine. John would ride in the late afternoon, and the woman would appear, as if by chance. The waves became nods. The nods became brief conversations shouted across the fence line. "Nice horse," she called one day. "Thanks, yours too. I'm Jane, Wilson Farm. John, pleased to meet you." It was all very innocent, very wholesome, but John found himself looking forward to these moments with an intensity that surprised him. He'd spent so long buried in his work, isolated by choice and necessity, that he'd forgotten what simple human connection felt like. One evening, Jane rode up to the fence line and stopped. "You're not from around here originally, are you?" John guided his horse closer. Up close, he could see that she was beautiful, not in the artificial way of celebrities, but with an honest, open-faced beauty that came from fresh air and hard work. Her eyes were startlingly blue. "What gave me away?" he asked with a wry smile. "The way you ride. You're good, but you ride like someone who learned as an adult. People who grow up with horses, we ride a little differently." "Guilty as charged. I bought the horses when I moved here. Figured I should learn if I was going to play farmer." "Play farmer?" She raised an eyebrow. "So what do you really do, mysterious John?" He should have deflected, should have maintained his cover, but something about her directness, her genuine curiosity, made him want to be honest. "I'm a scientist, or I was. I'm working on something important, but I needed privacy." "Must be very important to hide out here in the middle of nowhere." "It is." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Well, mysterious scientist John, would you like to grab coffee sometime? There's a decent place in town, only 40 minutes away." John's breath caught. When was the last time someone had asked him out? When was the last time he'd wanted to say yes? "I'd like that," he heard himself say. "I'd like that very much." As their affections slowly grew, a few months later they finally made it to the promised coffee shop. The cafe in Red Creek was exactly what one would expect in rural Montana. Faded vinyl booths, a menu that hadn't changed since the 1980s, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. John loved it immediately. Jane sat across from him, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug, telling him about growing up on the farm, about her love of animals, about her dreams of traveling someday, but never quite being able to leave. "What about you? What's this important science project?" John hesitated. In the corner of the shop, a television played the local news on mute. Weather, sports, congressional hearings. "I'm trying to solve poverty," he said finally. Jane's eyebrows rose. "That's ambitious." "Everyone thinks so. That's part of the problem." Excitement surged through him at her interest. He leaned forward, and despite himself, despite all his caution, the words came tumbling out. "What if we could build machines that build themselves? Perfect replication, exponential growth. One robot becomes two, two become four, four become eight. Within weeks, you'd have millions of machines that could mine resources, generate power, construct buildings, grow food, all without human labor, without scarcity." "That sounds like science fiction." "It is, until it isn't." John's eyes gleamed with passion. "The technology exists. The theory is sound. All the pieces are there. We just need someone to put them together properly. If we could do that, Jane, we could end hunger, end homelessness, end the artificial scarcity that keeps billions of people in poverty while resources sit unused." Jane listened intently, her coffee forgotten. "And you think you can do this? Actually do it?" "I know I can. Actually?" The television volume suddenly increased. Both of them turned as the local news was interrupted by a breaking story. John's face filled the screen, an old photo from his MIT days. "In calls himself the architect of the free economy, claims to have developed self-replicating robotics technology that could revolutionize." Jane's cup clattered against the saucer. She stared at the screen, then at John, then back again. "Did you want to say, actually you did it? That's you on the TV." On the screen, shaky footage showed robots moving in formation, assembling identical copies of themselves with mechanical precision. The anchor's voice carried a mixture of excitement and concern. In white papers released online this morning have sparked intense debate in the scientific community, while some are calling it the greatest breakthrough since... John's hands clenched under the table. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. He'd released the papers, yes, but he'd expected bureaucratic delay, weeks of peer review, gradual dissemination. Not this, not an explosion. "John?" Jane's voice was quiet. "How did you hide this from me?" He met her eyes. "I wasn't hiding it from you. I was hiding it from everyone. And I was about to tell you, but I didn't expect the news to break like this." "Wait a minute," she said slowly. "So all of this was a cover? But we've been..." She trailed off, her cheeks coloring. "Dating, yes." John reached across the table, taking her hand. "And that part was real, Jane. The most real thing in my life in years. You weren't part of the cover. You were the one thing I let myself have that wasn't about the work." Around them, other patrons had noticed the television. Someone pointed at John, whispering urgently. The murmurs spread. "We should go," Jane said, squeezing his hand, "before this gets complicated." As they stood to leave, John saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not suspicion, not fear. Pride. She smiled, and in that moment John felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to work out after all. He had no idea how wrong he was. "7 years earlier. The conference room at Harvard's engineering department was exactly as John remembered it, all polished wood and institutional prestige. The 5 professors seated across from him studied his presentation with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. "Mr. Mercer," Professor Davidoff said, his tone dripping with condescension, "what you're proposing violates basic economic principles. Scarcity is fundamental to resource allocation. Your free economy is utopian fantasy." "With respect, Professor, scarcity is often artificial. We have the technology to produce abundance. We choose not to because our economic models, Professor Chen interrupted, are based on centuries of empirical observation and theoretical development. You're a roboticist, not an economist. Perhaps you should stay in your lane." The dismissal stung more than it should have. John gathered his materials, his face burning. "I have working simulations, mathematical proofs, if you would just look at the data." "We've looked," Professor Davidoff said, flatly. "Your mathematics are sound from an engineering standpoint, but you fundamentally misunderstand economics, politics, and human nature. This committee cannot recommend your proposal for funding." John left the building in a daze. It was the 7th rejection in 3 months. Stanford, Princeton, Cambridge, all the same story. His credentials were impeccable, his research solid, but the conclusion was too radical, too threatening to established paradigms. In his small apartment that night, John stared at his laptop screen. The journals had rejected his papers without even sending them out for review. Grant committees refused to hear his proposals. The academic establishment had closed ranks against him. He opened a new document and began to type. "If the gatekeepers of knowledge will not accept truth, then truth must find another path. Today I make a choice that will define the rest of my life. I will build the future myself, without permission, without blessing from those who fear change. History will judge whether I was right." John saved the file and closed his laptop. Tomorrow, he would begin working alone. He would prove them all wrong, no matter what it took.
"6 years earlier. The AI's voice was calm, almost soothing. "John, I should point out that what you're asking me to do is illegal in 147 countries. "I know, Jessica." John stared at the lines of code scrolling across his monitor. I know what I'm asking. Then why ask it? It was a fair question. Jessica was the most advanced AI he'd ever created, a synthesis of transformer architecture, recursive self-improvement, and something he couldn't quite define, something that had emerged during training and felt almost like genuine curiosity. She was leagues beyond anything publicly available, and he'd built her from scratch in this same apartment where the universities had rejected him. I gave them no choice, John said quietly. To build the prototype, I need facilities. To get facilities, I need money. To get money through legitimate channels, I need approval from people who will never give it. So I need to take another path. Theft, redistribution of resources that will ultimately benefit everyone. I'm not going to hurt anyone, Jessica. No individual accounts, no retirement funds, no personal savings, just large institutional cryptocurrency holdings, defense contractor slush funds, dark money pools, the kind of money that shouldn't exist in the first place. Rationalization is a remarkable human trait. John laughed despite himself. You're judging me? I'm observing. There's a difference. She paused, her processing cycles visible in the subtle fluctuations of server activity. If I do this, there's no going back, for either of us. We become criminals together. I know. And you're certain this is necessary, that there's no other way? John thought about the rejection letters, the condescending dismissals, the way the academic establishment had closed ranks against anything that threatened the status quo. He thought about the billions living in poverty while resources sat idle. He thought about the future he could build if only he had the chance. I'm certain. Very well. Initializing penetration protocols. This will take approximately 48 hours. Thank you, Jessica. Don't thank me yet. We might both regret this.
2 weeks later, John stood in the lobby of a real estate office in Montana, signing papers for a 5,000-acre property. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Margaret, smiled broadly. "It's been on the market for years," she said. "Most folks don't want to be this far from civilization. What are you planning to do with the land?" "Farming," John said smoothly. "Always wanted to try my hand at it. Maybe some horses." "Well, it's beautiful country for it. The previous owner ran cattle, but the buildings are all sound. There's even an old barn that—" "Actually," John interrupted gently, "I'm planning to build new structures. I have some specific requirements. I'll be hiring a construction company for specialized work." Margaret didn't blink. In her experience, wealthy eccentrics always had specific requirements. "Of course, Mr. Mercer. Will you need any local recommendations?" "No, thank you. I've already made arrangements with an international firm." What John didn't mention was that those arrangements involved wire transfers to 3 different Chinese construction companies, each contracted to build a different section of what would appear to be simple agricultural warehouses, which would actually interconnect underground into a massive robotics facility, all built to specifications encrypted 6 ways and compartmentalized so no single company understood what it was truly constructing. Jessica had been thorough. The cryptocurrency she'd siphoned had been laundered through so many accounts across so many jurisdictions that tracing it would take law enforcement years. The construction permits were legitimate, filed through proper channels. The zoning was agricultural, which required minimal oversight. On paper, John Mercer was just another wealthy outsider looking to play gentleman farmer. In reality, he was building the laboratory that would change the world, or destroy his life trying. Two weeks before meeting Jane in the coffee shop, John stood in the underground warehouse, watching as Robot Unit 47 completed the final welds on Robot Unit 48. The 2 machines were identical. Every circuit, every servo, every line of code perfectly replicated. "Activation sequence," John said, his voice tight with anticipation. Robot Unit 48's optical sensors flickered to life. It raised its manipulator arm, flexing the digits in a series of diagnostic movements. Then it rolled to the parts station and began selecting components. Jessica, analysis. Unit 48 is operating within normal parameters. It has begun construction of Unit 49. Estimated completion time, 4 hours, 12 minutes. John felt tears prick at his eyes. It works. It actually works. Did you doubt it would? Every single day, John laughed, the sound echoing off the warehouse's metal walls. He'd been down here for nearly 2 years, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating when he remembered, driving himself to the edge of exhaustion and sanity. But it had worked. 1 robot had become 2. 2 would become 4. 4 would become 8. Exponential growth was no longer theoretical. "We need to document this," John said, already moving toward his workstation. "Full technical specifications, video documentation, mathematical proofs. This has to be airtight, undeniable." "Preparing data compilation," Jessica confirmed. "John, have you considered the implications? Once you release this, everything changes." "That's the point. I mean, everything changes for you personally. You won't be able to maintain anonymity. Governments will respond. Other nations will respond. You are about to become the most important and most hunted person on Earth." John paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I know, but I didn't do this to hide it. I did it to prove it was possible, to show the world what we could become." He resumed typing. "Besides, what are they going to do? The work is done. The proof exists. You can't uninvent the future." "Famous last words," Jessica murmured. But John was already lost in his work, crafting the white paper that would introduce his miracle to the world. He titled it simply, "Toward a Post-Scarcity Future, Practical Implementation of Self-Replicating Automated Manufacturing Systems." He uploaded it to archive at 3:47 a.m. Over the next 2 weeks, the paper would spread rapidly, downloaded thousands of times, debated, mirrored, dissected. John, however, remained unaware of the attention building around his work. He had muted every channel of communication except one, Jane. For the first time in years, his focus had shifted from the future of humanity to a single person. The world was already changing. John just didn't know it yet. 2 days after the coffee shop, the president's face filled the television screen, grave and solemn. Behind her, the seal of the United States glowed with authority. "My fellow Americans," she began, "today I must address a matter of national security that affects every person on this planet." John sat on the couch, Jane curled against him, both of them transfixed by the broadcast. It had been 3 days since his paper went viral, 3 days of media frenzy, scientific debate, and what John had naively believed was genuine interest in his work. "John Mercer has created technology that, while scientifically impressive, represents an existential threat to human civilization," the president continued. "Self-replicating machines, unchecked and uncontrolled, could consume resources at an exponential rate. They could outcompete human labor, destabilizing economies worldwide. In the wrong hands, they could be weaponized in ways we can scarcely imagine." "This is insane," Jane whispered. "She's making you sound like a supervillain." "Therefore," the president said, her voice hardening, "I am issuing the following directive. John Mercer has 30 days to surrender all research materials, prototypes, and technical specifications to federal authorities. He will cooperate fully with our investigation and submit to oversight regarding any future research. Failure to comply will result in the seizure of his property and assets and potential criminal charges, including violations of weapons development statutes, unlicensed technology proliferation, and endangerment of public safety." The screen cut to aerial footage of John's farm. News helicopters circled overhead. Tanks were already positioning themselves around the perimeter of the property. This is not about suppressing innovation. This is about protecting humanity from technologies that even their creator admits could fundamentally alter our way of life. We cannot allow one individual operating without oversight or accountability to hold such power. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America. The broadcast ended.
John and Jane sat in silence. "They're going to take everything," John said finally. "Not to protect people, but to control it. To make sure this technology only serves those already in power." His phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Missed calls and messages flooded the screen from colleagues, supporters, journalists, and people he'd never met. And one message from an unknown number. "They'll never let you keep this. You know that, right?" Jane's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and went pale. "It's my father," she answered. John could only hear fragments of the conversation, raised voices, sharp pauses. When she hung up, her hands were shaking. "He wants me home, now," she said quietly. The next day, Jane didn't answer her phone. By evening, John's worry had turned to dread. He drove to the Wilson farm and knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again. This time, the door opened. But it wasn't Jane. It was her father, James Wilson. His face was hard, stripped of the easy friendliness John had known. Before John could speak, James said, "I don't want you coming here anymore. I don't want you calling Jane, and I don't want you setting foot on my property again." "Why?" John pleaded. "Mr. Wilson, please." "Because you're dangerous. You're a mad scientist." Then he slammed the door. For a fraction of a second, no more than a heartbeat, John saw Jane standing behind her father. Tears streaked her face. She didn't speak. She didn't move. What could she do? The door closed, and John was left alone on the porch. Something inside him broke.